financial fraud ever. It's a $50 billion Ponzi scheme, and it's quite extensive, and despite the time frame, they're still dealing with some of the drawbacks from it. Let me get this on the screen here real quick. One moment, please.
2.5 months since Bernard L. Madoff was picked up and charged with what's believed to be the largest financial fraud in history. Yet we still don't know much more about the alleged $50 billion scam than what Madoff initially told the FBI agents who arrested him. There are still no indictments as federal prosecutors continue to unravel the case and to try and figure out exactly what happened and who all was involved. But the proof that it happened can be found in the ruined lives of thousands of victims. The one person who knows the most and is willing to talk is Harry Markopolos, the man who figured out Madoff's scheme before anyone else. He sat down with us for his only television interview. Until a few months ago, Harry Markopolos was an obscure financial analyst and mildly eccentric fraud investigator from Boston, who most people would never notice on the street.
My modern Greek hero, how you doing?
But today he enjoys an almost heroic status, pursued by journalists and movie producers and honored by colleagues as the man who went to the Securities and Exchange Commission and blew the whistle on Bernie Madoff in his $50 billion fraud.
Thank you. Thank you. Please take your seats.
But he seems uncomfortable with all the attention and knows that he is no hero.
I stand before you, a $50 billion failure.
How many times did you send material to the SEC?
May 2000, October 2001, October, November, and December 2005, then again June 2007, and finally April 2008. So 5 separate SEC submissions.
And in spite of all of the things that you did, it still ended up in disaster.
There's nothing to be proud about in this case. I feel horrible about the result. It's been a total disaster for the victims.
It began a decade ago when Markopolos was working for a Boston investment firm. His boss told him that Bernard Madoff, a former chairman of the NASDAQ stock exchange, was running a huge unregistered hedge fund that was producing incredible returns. He wanted Harry to reverse engineer its trading strategy and revenue streams so that the firm could duplicate Madoff's results.
He had the patina of being a respected citizen, one of the most successful businessmen in New York, and certainly one of the most powerful men on Wall Street. You would never suspect him of fraud unless you knew the math.
So, I mean, you're like a math guy, right?
I've taken all the calculus courses from integral calculus.
I can't get everything in review, but let me advance this a bit. One moment, please.
In 2001, it was a little bit more real. By 2005, I had 29 red flags that you just couldn't miss on. By 2005, the degree of certainty was approaching 100%.
Over time, and with some simple math calculations, Markopolos concluded that for Madoff to execute the trading strategy he said he was using, he would have had to buy more options on the Chicago Options Exchange than actually existed. Yet he says no one he spoke to there remembered making a single trade with Bernie Madoff's fund.
I would talk to the people I had trading relationships with and ask, did you have a trading relationship with Mr. Bernard Madoff? And they all said, no, we don't think he's for real.
Could you find anybody?
I found no one that ever traded with Mr. Madoff, and I traded with the largest equity derivatives firms in the world.
And that's because Madoff's investment fund never actually made any trades, at least going back to 1993 and probably further. A fact confirmed last week at a meeting of Madoff investors by the trustee charged with liquidating his assets. No one knew the depth of the fraud, but a lot of people had questions. Who else figured this out besides you?
I would say that hundreds of people suspected something was amiss with the Madoff operation. If you look at who the victims were not, you'll notice that the major firms on Wall Street had no money with Mr. Madoff.
I mean, you write this is the letter, I'm quoting from the letter to the Securities and Exchange Commission, red flag number 20. Madoff is suspected of being a fraud by some of the world's largest, most sophisticated financial services firms. And then you list some of the firms.
Yes, I do.
The biggest firms on Wall Street, and conversations with people high up in those firms.
That is correct. And the SEC ignored that.
Did they call it?
Let me advance this a bit more.
Besides his niece's husband, who no longer works at the SEC, Madoff has had long-standing ties to the agency and has been called upon to give advice. At this 2007 meeting of a nonprofit group called the Philoctetes Center, Madoff seemed to think the SEC was doing a great job.
You know, in today's regulatory environment, it's virtually impossible to violate rules. And this is something that the public really doesn't understand. But it's impossible for you to for a violation to go undetected. Certainly not for a considerable period of time.
But don't try and tell that to the Philoctetes Center today. Its main benefactor, the Betty and Norman Levy Foundation, was fully invested in Madoff, one of dozens of charitable organizations that have been devastated or wiped out. Madoff's customer list, single-spaced with small type, is 162 pages long, with victims running the gamut from Hollywood royalty to a carpenter's pension fund in Syracuse, New York.
And that's, as you can see, it's quite an extensive Ponzi scheme. A lot of people invested with them. And let me get this on the screen.
And because they thought they were making 12% a year, they weren't inclined to ask a lot of questions. Harry Markopoulos called it the classic affinity scam.
An affinity scam is when you prey on groups that are similar in nature to yourself. So I'm Greek. If I was going to run an affinity scam, I would run it on the Greek-American community here. Bernie was Jewish, so he ran it on the Jewish community in the United States, but that wouldn't get him enough customers because he always needed new money to keep the scheme going.
Over time, Madoff extended his reach from New York to Palm Beach, where he enlisted hundreds of wealthy clients, many of them recruited from his own country clubs. And he also made connections that gave him entree to Europe and the hedge fund capital of America, Greenwich, Connecticut. It was here that Bernie Madoff made some of his biggest deals with large investment firms that were willing to feed him billions of dollars of their clients' money to manage. And in return, Bernie Madoff agreed to pay these so-called feeder funds a fortune in annual fees. The largest of the feeder funds was the Fairfield Greenwich Group.
And let me get a final screen on here. Let me get the last point to ponder. One moment.
You think that really happened?
No, we know it didn't happen because we know all they did was turn the money over to Bernie Madoff, and they did that for 20 years.
They did nothing.
They essentially did nothing except lose their investors' money and enjoy very luxurious lifestyles from the money they took out.
Walter Knoll, one of the founding partners of Fairfield Greenwich, declined to talk to us and has reportedly been lying low with his wife at their compound on the private island of Mystique. But in a statement to 60 Minutes, his firm said that it too was a victim of Bernie Madoff, that it had placed too much trust in his then impeccable reputation and in the fact that there had been multiple reviews of Madoff by the SEC. In the end, Harry Markopoulos had been right about Bernie Madoff. He will be going to prison, but not because of anything that Harry or the SEC did. In a bad economy, Madoff's lies simply collapsed under their own weight.
No one was invested.
And that's a quick review of the very big Ponzi scheme run by him. And like I said, they're still doing trying to claw back some of the money back to the original investigators. And it's quite a story. A lot of stuff on the internet about that, and several books have been written. And that'll do it.